Hello everybody and welcome back to Piano Practice Partner. I hope you're doing well. Can you believe it? We are 2 months into learning the piano. That's right, for the last 8 weeks we've been learning from the very beginnings of our piano journey up to this point. Well done for sticking with it for this amount of time. I hope you've really enjoyed these lessons and are getting lots out of it. Today we're going to be looking back and consolidating everything we've done over the last 8 weeks and just refreshing our memory to make sure everything is really clear and understood, so that when we move into the next month and the next 2 months and the next 6 months and the next year, we're building, and we're seeing our progress, which will hopefully keep us motivated, moving forward, progressing week by week, month by month, year by year. So we don't lose heart, we don't lose faith, we are seeing our progress. And I have already noticed the leaps and bounds I've made with sort of my fingers and my hands and how my brain is connecting the two together. So I hope you're doing the same. And this is a real good opportunity today to just lay that all down and see how far we've come in a relatively short space of time. We should be really proud. So congratulations to you. So in week 1, we started just looking very simply at this keyboard, this piano, and breaking down the fact that there are so many keys that it's quite overwhelming. And we made the distinction that, and if you look at it, there are only 2 real options, the white keys or the black keys. We then broke that down even further, and rather than having the keyboard being really overwhelming with all these options, we then looked and saw that there are repeating sections up and down the keyboard, comprising of all these white notes here, and then these 5 black notes. And this just repeats from here to here, here to here, here to here, and on the way down as well. And we found out that between this point and this point, if we play all the notes chromatically, we found out there's only 12 notes. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. And then the repeat of this note, 13, is the same as this note. So between here and here, only 12 notes, and this is the same note as here. And we found out that was called an octave. And that if we went up the keyboard, the pitch got higher. So pitch tells us how high or low a note is. So what I'm doing now is playing all C's at different octaves, different pitches. So the further we go down the left of the keyboard, the lower the note. The higher we go up the right of the keyboard, the higher the note. We also identified that this one is called middle C, and this is kind of our starting point for a lot of the music we'll be playing and expanding from. And as we get better and better and more confident and competent, we'll start using all of this. But for now, we're just focusing really on these 12 notes. We then broke that down even further and looked at our very first scale, the C major scale, which starts on this middle C. And instead of 12 notes, we identified that there were 8 notes from C to C. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. With the 8 again, as we can see and hear, is our octave. So there are only 8 notes in a scale. So we learnt, to begin with, our first scale, the C major scale. And we learnt to play it with our right hand, up the keyboard, and down the keyboard. That's huge. And then we did the same with our left hand. And then came the real challenge, which was putting them together. But we got there. We did it. Both of them together, united. Really exciting. We then, from our C major scale, then looked at our C major chord. So we played our first chord and we put our root note in the bass. So we put C in the bass, and then we played C, E, G. We then took that chord and used it as a basis for understanding what makes a major chord. It's not just the hand position, because later on we found out that if we took that same hand position and put it up here, it's actually a minor chord rather than a major chord. But the hand is in the same position, the same spacing of notes appears. So why isn't it a major chord? So we found out that a major chord comprised of the first, the third, and the fifth. So in C major, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, those numbers that I was counting, we just found out where the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So we found out where 1, 3, and 5 was. and that made our major chord. Then looking at this A minor chord, we found out why it isn't a major chord, and it's because of this note here, the third. And so if we're making a minor chord, this third would be flattened. So if we go back to our C major, if we took this third and we took it down half a step, it becomes a minor chord. So we learnt the difference between a whole note and a half note. So a whole note would be when there is a note between the two notes. So between C and D, this is a whole note because there is a note here in the way. If we were playing C to C sharp, it's a half note or a half step because there's nothing between them. So we found out the difference between whole notes and half notes. Especially interesting when we get to here, because there's no black note that separates them, but there's also nothing between them. So this, between E and F, would also be a half note or a half step. And using that knowledge, we then went on and figured out any major chord by using a sequence of whole notes and half notes to tell us what the scale is. So let's do that again now to refresh our memories. So I'll write it down really quickly and cut to it so we're not wasting time. So here was the formula that told us how to figure out any major scale. So we take that for the C major scale. It's a whole note. So we're trying to find the whole note from C, or the whole step. So we're missing out the black note. Whole note, then a whole note, then a half note. So this is a half note here. So there's nothing between them. Then another whole step, then another whole step, another whole step, and then a half step because there's nothing between them. So we already knew the C major, but that's the sequence of whole and half steps. And then we thought, let's test that theory by, hey, let's do it for F major. So we're starting on F here, whole note. So where's the next whole note? It's here, then another whole note, and then a half step. So it'd be up here, and then another whole. So we'd skip here, another whole, and then another half. Magic. Just by knowing this, we can then take that for any other. So let's just, I'm just going to randomly close my eyes and just hit a note. G. Cool. So let's do it with G. So whole, half, whole. Hey, so there's the whole note. We have to skip here and then half. Wow. So we've now figured out G major. Just by following this sequence. Magic. So we've figured out our major chords. We've figured out how to find any scale using the whole, half method. We've figured out why a major chord is made up the way it is and why it's a minor, because you flatten the third. Unbelievable. We then went on and learned loads of chords. We learned C major. We learned G major. We learned F major as our majors. Then we added this one, which we've spoken about earlier. This chord, the A minor chord, because this third is flattened. So if we sharpened it by putting it up here, that's A major. This is A minor. So same hand position, but we go from major to minor. And then we took all this and we made our first song. We didn't make our first song, we learnt our first song. Imagine if we'd written Let It Be by the Beatles on our own. That'd be insanely good for 2 months worth of practice. But we learnt Let It Be by the Beatles, which is arguably one of the most famous songs in history. And it was just using these very simple chords, and then a little run, and then the bridge section, all these little steps, and then back to the first bit with a run. Incredible. Just by taking the knowledge that we very quickly learnt together, we then arranged it in a way that led to our first song. It's super exciting. From there, we're rattling through this, I know, but it's really, really cool how far we've come. This is incredible. Like, we should be really proud of ourselves for starting with nothing and then getting to this point in 8 weeks. From these chords that we've made, these very simple, sort of basic versions of the chords, we then looked at a thing called inversions. And inversions basically means that we were taking the chord and just rearranging it. So coming back to our C again, C, E, G, If we wanted to play this in inversion, we would just take these exact notes and reorder them. So rather than having the C down here, we figured out that a good way to start with inversions is just taking the bottom note and placing it on top. So instead of C, E, G, it would then become E, G, C. So this is still a C major chord, just in a different position. And by using that same logic, we could then take the bottom note now, which is our E, and move it to the top. So then it would be, rather than E, G, C, it would be G, C, E. And then if we did that again, from the G, from the bottom to the top, we would then go, instead of G, C, E, we'd go to C, E, G, which is our original position, just an octave higher. So we went through and practiced going through our various inversions. And we did that for our G chord. And our F. And our A minor, and all the chords we've learned, etc., etc. We try to get them really in our brains and in our fingers, because there's a really useful application for inversions. There's two really good versions. So one was just variation. Say you have to cycle a chord for a long time. It might get stale very quickly, so we can add these variations in, which just gives a bit more texture and a bit more colour. The other reason, and arguably the more important reason, was rather than picking up your hand having to jump up and down, we could use inversions to stop that, or stop some of that. So rather than playing C to G here, which requires me to pick my hand up and move it quite a distance, I could play C here. Because look, C, E, G, which is our C chord. But instead of having to move my hand all this distance, I'm now just having to move these two fingers. So we could play Let It Be like this to give us less movement. Or just variation, because then we can play the C here and carry on. Isn't that nice? So inversions was super, super useful, really handy for us to know. We then looked at a structure known as the 2-5-1. Let's write that down here, 2, 5, 1. And identified that this is incredibly important in music and used a lot over pop and blues and jazz. Crops up everywhere. We know our Roman numerals are to help us to take a structure or a sequence of notes or chords and just be able to move them up and down in different keys. We're concerning ourselves with the C major right now because there are no sharps and there are no flats. It's all these white notes, so it's a bit easier for us as beginners to understand. But we know that it's 1 to 8. And so quite quickly we identified that a 2-5-1 means we just play the 2 chord, the 5 chord, and the 1 chord. So as single notes, it's this. And then we put our chords on top. So we learned our very simple 2-5-1. And we try to understand why it's important in music. So we spoke about tension and resolution. That going from the 2 to the 5 creates this sense of openness. There's nothing that's been ended or closed off or resolved. So moving from the 2 to the 5 feels like when we come back to the 1, we have a finality, we have an end point. And we try to musically understand that by just playing the 2 to the 5 and then just leaving it like that. You feel like it just hangs suspended in the air. What's next? And some songs use this on purpose because you do want to leave a question mark, an unanswered question. But if we do the same thing and then close it, we answer the question, it feels like we land in a sense of like, satisfaction, because we've come back and we've arrived at the place that we anticipated. So we're building tension and then resolving that tension. You really feel it, don't you? It makes sense. So that's why this was important to understand and learn. And in later lessons, we are going to expand on this a bit more because, again, we've learnt it in its very basic form. But we spoke briefly about adding in extra notes such as fourths and sixths and ninths in order to give it a bit more of a different feel. So we're going to look at all that stuff in the coming lessons because it's really fun. It just adds a bit more colour and texture and information for us and our ears to latch onto. So we looked at the 2-5-1. We then took what we'd learnt the previous week about inversions and applied it to our 2-5-1. So rather than this big jump from D to G, we then looked at our notes from the D to the G and we thought, what happens if we just move these two fingers up? There's our G. G, B, D. We're just playing it now here. D, G, B. So we can go from our D, our 2 chord, to our 5 chord just by moving these two fingers. And then our 1. Or we can go D, and then we can also use an inversion for our C chord. There you go. So we're just moving our hand up. Rather than all this jumping around, we then quite comfortably just did that. Magic. So we're taking the knowledge each week and we're just expanding and layering on top of. It's not incidental, it's all really, really useful. Then we moved on to kind of a fun one. We then started to look at improvisation. So we were making up some notes, just using the C major scale from C to C. We were just playing with listening to what we were doing and getting curious about sequences and patterns and expanding on patterns. Also, this idea of tension and resolution we learned the previous week. We found that if we were playing and we resolved back to the 1, the C, it felt like we closed off the improvisation and it had a nice ending. So we were just fun. And then something else. We just spent some time playing and exploring, and with our left hand as well. And all that was leading towards the next lesson, where we started to structure the improvisation in a more considered way. So we looked at our second scale in proper detail. We know the whole, whole, half that we learnt last time, and we applied that to F major. So we learned our second proper scale, the F major scale, and it had the addition of this black note, this A sharp or B flat. And we learned it with our right hand, as we did with our C chord. And we learned it with our left hand, and then we learned it together. And even though it felt a bit different because we're having to do this little step up to this black note, the process is essentially the same. We identified the fingers and where we switch over, and we in both hands, and they switch at different times, and then we tied them together. And hopefully I found that was easier to do than I anticipated. It wasn't easy, but it felt easier because I'd already had the knowledge of doing that with the C major, that my brain had sort of understood that, yes, okay, we have to slightly stagger where the hands go, the fingers go, in order to play that in unison. So we took our F major scale, and then we looked at how we turned it into a blues scale. And we identified that we flattened the 3rd, the 5th, and the 7th note of the scale. Very much in the same way we've identified where the 1st and the 2nd and the 5th is for like the 2-5-1, or for when we're playing Let It Be and we wrote it out as Roman numerals, from the 1 to the 5 to the 6 to the 4. We did the same thing for this F major. So we now know the usefulness and the validity of using Roman numerals is because now we can just pick up this concept of 1 to 8 from the C, and rather than be fixed to C, now it just changes to F. So now our new 1 becomes the F. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So we just had to find where the 3, the 5, and the 7 was. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So it's these notes. And we just had to flatten them. And we know from the major minor exploration that we're just taking that half a step down. So this note becomes this note becomes this note, and this note becomes this note. So now in our F blues, we're playing the addition of these 2 extra black notes, as well as the one we've just identified. This might be quite a clunky way of explaining it with my fingers just covering so much of the board. But instead of, it then became, but there's one other thing we learned about this. We omitted the G. So rather than in this F major scale, which we do play the G, we've now flattened the 3rd, the 5th, and the 7th, but we've also missed out this G. So we skip over. We did briefly talk about how you can use these other notes within that blues scale. But it becomes a slightly different thing. And so rather than jumping ahead to that, we were trying to be really specific and not rigid, but to define the parameters of which we're exploring right now so that we understand them and then can build on them later, rather than sort of put stuff in ad hoc and not really know why we're doing it. I think it's really important to understand. So we left out the G for now and we were just playing. And we did that with the left hand as well. We've taken what we'd done the previous week with improvisation, put on a backing track, and we started improvising using this blues scale. And it was really fun because all of a sudden we were making real music. It felt like magic. We'd taken a scale, which sometimes I think in scales they feel dry, or we're doing like exercises where it feels a bit like we're learning vocabulary or learning like grammar, which we are doing, but very quickly that turns into actual music. You can see immediately how you take something that could be deemed as boring, but it has a real application. So it's worth wading through that stuff and trying to understand it. Immediately, we were able to apply it into music and make some cool sounds and feel like we know what we're doing. You could whack on that backing track and just like improvise for hours and find new things. And I'm sure if you were doing that busking on the street, people would throw money on your hat. So I might try it and let you know how I get on. But that's it. That's 2 months worth of work. I hope you're proud of yourselves, because coming from nothing, no understanding of this thing, to where we're at now, in 8 weeks' time, it's mammoth the amount of work that you've packed in and that you've digested and got under the fingers. This week, I don't think I'll do a practice along session, as I think it will be really important to look back on this video and what we've learned and just identify, okay, what have I really understood? What haven't I understood so well? What do I need more work on? And go back to maybe that video lesson and just try and understand it again, or go back to that practice along session. So you've got the timer and you can practice along, just so that as we're moving into the next bank of lessons, the next month, the next 2 months, we're not leaving part of our knowledge neglected. Because I think as humans, we're very good at that. We're very good at knowing where the strengths are and knowing where our weaknesses are, and sort of ignoring the weaknesses and focusing on the strengths because it's the stuff we're good at. But it's really important within our learning and with our instruments that we're upskilling every aspect. So we've got this really, especially in the beginning, we've got this really solid base to build from then. Because if we get way further down the line and we're like, oh, I really want to learn this style of music, or I want to do this, but we've been ignoring the trickier stuff from the early days, it's going to be so much harder to then go back and graft all the way up to the point we need to be at. Whereas we're slowly chipping away at it now. But by the time we get to that point where we know where we want to be heading, we've got the skills at our disposal to be able to action that more readily available to us. So I hope that makes sense. It's a really good challenge. Treat it as a nice, fun exploration. Celebrate where you've excelled at and what feels really good. That is amazing that we've got this far. But be honest with yourself of, okay, what's really struggling? Okay, my left hand's really struggling, personally, to keep up with my right. So I can really push the scale speed now with my right a bit more, but my left's not there. So rather than going, I'm getting frustrated and either pushing ahead with this one, leaving this one really far behind, I know over this week I'm going to set a metronome and a bit of practice time and just drill my C major and my F major scale and my blues scale with my left hand and just try and get it up to a point where it can meet my right so then they can grow together to the next stage. So rather than that being a hassle, treat it as a fun challenge, a fun exercise. Can I, where can I find the game and the draw for me pushing through and reaching the next stage? Thank you for tuning in every week. It really means the world to me knowing that there are other people out there finding real use from this channel. So I hope it continues. Please, if you're not subscribed already, please subscribe. Tell your friends who want to learn the piano because, we're still at the very early stages. So there's still time for them to not get too far behind. But wherever you're watching this from, whatever cycle we're in, we might be 5 years in by now. Who knows? Obviously, go back to the start and just follow in your own ledger up to the point where we're at. Well done, everybody. Congratulations for making it 2 months into piano practicing with Piano Practice Partner. Really proud of you. Really proud of us. Stick with it, and I will see you in the next lesson.